Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 4, Episode 35. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. There's a documentary on Netflix now about boy bands. The producer of the biggest boy bands that ever existed during the 90s turns out to be the biggest scammer, one of the longest running Ponzi schemes in American, probably world history. And it just goes to show you that at the heart of pop music, is it corruption? Is it greed? Is it despair? I'll leave it up to you to decide, dear listener. At its very best, or perhaps we should say, being as generous as we can, it's audible McDonald's. And it certainly ruined music in the late 90s and destroyed MTV. And a college football preview segment. To the extent that any one person can keep up with all of the machinations of college football in the year of our Lord 2024. Thank you all for listening. To those who are new to the podcast, please like, subscribe, thumbs up, 5-star, write a review, send to friends, to enemies far and wide. This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is on Patreon. If you like what you hear, please consider supporting.
Act 1, The Boy Band Phenomenon.
There is a documentary on Netflix called Dirty Pop. It's about the promoter that created a number of boy bands in the mid to late 90s. And it's not that good. This segment isn't going to be breaking down that documentary. I wouldn't even advise watching it. It's one of those documentaries, and I've seen a number of these now on Netflix, where when you watch all of the content in the documentary, you realize that maybe a 3-episode, a 5-episode, sometimes even a 6 or 8-episode documentary could have better been condensed into either a full-length feature film, a documentary that's like maybe an hour and 30 minutes long, an hour and 40 minutes long, or perhaps a couple of episodes that each spanned 1 hour. I believe in the lust to get the next big story, the next big thing. There's so many ideas being pitched, and everyone's saying, oh, we can definitely draw this out for 3 episodes, for 5 episodes. And you look at the content, and it's not that good. In fact, specific to the Dirty Pop documentary, it was basically a documentary about boy bands, and only at the end were the fundamental issues with how this promoter funded his boy band enterprise. It was only at the end that these issues are explored. And they're not even explored that cleverly. Basically, it was a Ponzi scheme, and the documentary doesn't do a very good job of explaining where all that money likely went. It was more involved with the personalities. It wanted to introduce you to all of the people as if the human interest story was more compelling than what actually happened to all that money. What I did want to comment about, though, was the fact that, yes, the guy who put together all those boy bands that ruined music in the mid-90s, that guy was a fraudster, and he ran the longest successful Ponzi scheme, I believe, in human history. That Ponzi scheme spanned a good 25 to 30 years. No, watching this documentary, I remembered how different the landscape of music was from the year 1992 to the year 1996. Memories are fallible. I had such great recollection of what the 90s were with regard to music, particularly how music influenced my life. And yet, in watching this documentary, I remember that by 1996, I'd pretty much given up on MTV. I never really watched it unless it was late on a Saturday night and I'd come back home from the bars and wanted to catch some of Headbangers Ball. MTV, for a good 36 months, was the icon of introducing new music into the public consciousness. It was the gatekeeper for all sorts of different types of music, whether that be hip-hop or rap, whether that be rock or pop. And what was interesting about that time for me is I'm looking at the landscape of the music industry in 1989, in 90 and 91, and what that meant to me. And then you see the perspective of the artists who were members of these boy bands. And they were looking at a desolate landscape. These guys were forming barbershop quartets. These things were in their infancy when Nirvana, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam were at their apex. Strangely enough, these guys felt left out of the musical landscape. They felt like they didn't have a home. I'm not going to do any research on this piece because I really don't even want to know the names of these bands. I just know that there's a bunch of boy bands, and one of them, because they couldn't catch on and become big, they had to tour in Germany. And then the one that had Marky Mark's brother in it, they broke through here in the US, and it looked like the landscape was now open for these boy bands. Boy bands have always been around. I do need to lay this foundation. Boy bands have always been around. When I was young, it was Menudo. If that doesn't ring a bell, go to your Google machine and type in Menudo, the Spanish food. It is the same name, Menudo Boy Band, and you will see many a YouTube clip and article about the boy band Menudo. Before that, in the 70s, there were a bunch of them. The Monkees. That one always rings a bell because I remember being very little and watching the television show that the Monkees had. And although people don't like this reality, and that's what it is, it's a truth, it's a reality, the Beatles were a boy band. The Beatles started out as a boy band. They are the most successful boy band that's ever existed because they looked at the fact that they were being packaged like a boy band and said, this is bullshit, and we're not going to do it anymore. Each of them as musicians was so talented that they were able to take their music not just in a slightly different direction, in a groundbreaking direction, and now people don't consider the Beatles a boy band. But that's all they were. They were packaged as a boy band. It worked. It made them a lot of money. They became self-aware and said, this is the biggest bunch of bullshit that we've ever seen. And we just so happen to be the catalysts. We are the alpha and the omega of this absolute and utter nonsense. They completely changed the direction of their music and their careers. Not many artists are that talented, and certainly none of the boy bands that came out in the 90s were that talented, but for maybe individual members. In fact, I think only one of them could actually be given that kind of respect, those kind of accolades, as the kids would say, those kinds of flowers, and that would be Justin Timberlake. But boy bands have always been around, and as the promoter, the fraudster, the Ponzi scheme creator, said numerous times and was quoted in this documentary as having said, there are always going to be boy bands because there's always going to be little girls. And my recollection of the 90s did not reflect that reality. Watching that documentary, it just struck me that I had pretty much quit on MTV by 1997 or 1998. Never watched it. Didn't even really tune in for any Headbangers Ball or anything they tried to do with any different genre music. I was just so disgusted with it. And it's because they went straight to pop. They went straight for the fast buck. And it never stopped. The trajectory of MTV, as far as chasing the quick buck, never stopped, because as soon as the reality genre proved promising and they didn't have to spend so much money to create authentic or original programming, they just went down that rabbit hole. If you've watched the documentary Trainwreck on Netflix, which is the documentary about the Woodstock 99 festival, which, by the way, that one is excellent. That one is well worth the time. I believe it's also 3 episodes, but it's 3 longer episodes, and it tells a very cohesive, cogent story throughout the course of the 3 episodes. One of the things that I found interesting about that documentary is that there was this underlying backlash in the culture of rock music that people like me who appreciated rock and roll, who were looking at progressive bands like Tool or Rage Against the Machine. I wasn't a huge fan of all the new metal bands. I did like Korn. I liked Static X. I liked System of a Down. There was a resentment, though, in what was happening with this pop culture movement with these boy bands versus these people who presciently could see the future, who realized that was all just chasing a fast buck, and that it wasn't really substantively going to last. If you watch that documentary Trainwreck, you see as that 1999 Woodstock Music Festival progresses, there's a recognition that it's all about the profit. It's all about the fast buck. And as more and more people understand that consciousness, they start to lash out at what they believe are the faces of that greed. That would be the MTV VJs, the video jockeys. I'd like to say that I'm above that. I don't know if I threw any tantrums in 1988 or 1999. I do know that I completely stopped watching MTV and I withdrew from a lot of the pop culture music that was going on at that time. And I have maintained that ignorance ever since. You look at pop music today, I don't know that any of the bands, any of the artists could be considered anything more than boy bands. It may be a solo artist, but the music, the way that it's marketed, it's all boy bandish. And it blows my mind that the guy who basically developed this formula that's still being used today to promote these pop artists was at his core a fraudster. Everything that he was selling was a lie. Although it's nowhere near dead, that may be the epitaph of pop music itself. It's all predicated on a lie.
Act 2, my ignorant college football preview segment.
I have no idea why this mechanical voice pronounced segment the way that it did. I tried to spell it like 5 or 6 different ways phonetically so that it would actually sound like segment, and for some reason she's pronouncing it
Segment.
Segment. It's segment, bitch. Whatever. This is why I need a producer. I need someone to come in and help me with this podcast, or at least an editor. I've spent way too much time trying to figure this out, and I'm not going to try to figure it out anymore. I'm just going to move on with the piece. And here's the essence of the piece. I'll sum up next 10 minutes in 30 seconds. I don't know anything about the current college football landscape. As many of you know, I canceled my cable subscription probably 2 years ago, and I don't have a lot of college football content popping up on my social media feeds or on my YouTube channel. So I just haven't been exposed to all of the different moves that have occurred over the course of the last 12 months. And I had on the Colorado, the CU Buffs versus the North Dakota State Bison football game on last night in the background, and they flashed up the Big 12, and I was like, wait a minute. Cincinnati's in the Big 12. Houston is in the Big 12. I quickly looked at the college football schedule on the ESPN app and just started looking at the conference matchups. And these look like games that we all ignored 5 years ago as a non-conference matchup in the middle of the season when these big college players, and I mean players in the sense that they were players in the marketplace for both the best college athletes and competing for a conference championship, if not a berth in the college football playoff. They're now playing all these teams that look like the Little Sisters of the Poor 5 years ago as part of their conference schedule. I really found myself going through week 6 and week 7 and just looking at the numbers next to the team's name. In other words, ranked team versus ranked team. It just struck me how many of these conferences now have teams that aren't going to be in the rankings and don't look like they would ever compete for a berth in the college football playoff, and yet now they have as equal an opportunity as any of some of these marquee or big name teams because they're in the right conference. I'm going to make this analogy because I don't want it to happen to me, but it did. And it's the analogy between my interest in college football and my interest in gaming, in video games. I used to be a pretty accomplished video gamer. Harken back to the year of our Lord, 1991, 1992. Let's just say throughout the course of the 90s, I was a pretty proficient video gamer. Mostly in the sports games. NHL 95 was a particular favorite. But I could hold my own in FIFA. I could hold my own in the college football game. One of my old college roommates when I was in graduate school and I actually played with the same team for an entire baseball season. That's right, 162 games. we each took one team and would play that team's schedule. And I admit this with shame. I am saying that I'm ashamed that this was the course or the state of affairs. That when the other person was playing their game, we would watch. That's right. We would sit there and watch the other person play their game to try to pick up on different game tactics, so things that you could do in the game, and then on the other person's tendencies or traits. Thankfully, we didn't have enough time to actually complete the seasons, even allowing the game to play itself. In other words, there's a mode you could put it on when if you couldn't play the game, you could actually just have the computer play the game, and it would help advance you into the schedule. Even having done that, we still didn't finish the 162 games. It was probably because we both picked teams in the same division, and so we played one another frequently, and those games took forever because we were so into those games that one baseball game could last an hour, 90 minutes, sometimes even 2 hours when both of us were struggling with our pitchers and our pen. Then the games got more and more advanced, and the controllers got more and more advanced. And then you had a lot of this gaming go to PCs, to your desktop computers. And those were even more complicated and more difficult to manipulate. And at one point, I just looked at the gaming landscape and I said, what the hell am I doing? Like, why am I spending so much time trying to master all of the different nuances, competing against kids who are 10, 12 years my junior? And again, this is in 1997, 1998. So I'd quit. And like any other type of addict, I'd end up relapsing. I'd go back to play a specific game, or I'd go back because of a specific new gaming system, and then I'd run right into the same problem. Then you run into the same problem, that the technology advances, the controllers, they advance, the gameplay, it's so complex. I just didn't feel like it warranted the amount of time and effort that I was putting into it, particularly given the output, which is just being successful in a video game and generally being able to lord your travails over someone online. You're basically just communicating with someone that you've never met before in your life. And I went back and forth with that for about 10 years until I finally was done with gaming altogether. That's how I feel about college football this year. And I don't want to feel that way about it. But I'm not going to go out and figure out who's in all of these conferences and where all the marquee matchups are. I don't know who the hell is in each conference now. And I'm certainly not going to subscribe to or buy in to some of these matchups that were usually reserved for bowl games now being part of a conference schedule. Like that should be any kind of big deal. As a University of Tennessee alum, I do see some of the things that are being mentioned about the football team. And there were people who were bitching about the fact that Tennessee's preseason ranking was number 15. And that seems so 5 years ago to me. It seems so 5 years ago to sit there and bitch about something as trivial as the ranking that your team is going to get if it's in one of the major conferences, because there's an expanded playoff where 12 teams are going to get an invite. So it's not as if that preseason ranking means anything if your team is going to have to play its way into that college football playoff by way of beating a bunch of other teams that have lower numbers next to their name. I don't want this to sound critical. I think there are people who are probably hanging on to the way they reacted to college football for decades, and in the new landscape, it just doesn't fit. The Pac-12 is dead. The Big 12 and the Big 10, these numbers don't even mean anything. They don't even mean anything. There's more teams in these conferences than there are the numbers next to their name. Florida State and Clemson are suing the ACC to get out of their obligation, their contract with that conference, likely so they can both move to the SEC. The whole thing is kind of like video gaming. It's changing too fast for this old man. I don't even want to keep up with it. I don't want to have to spend the time and effort to keep up with all of these changes. I don't have enough time even to change the podcast so that I can have a robotic voice say the word segment properly. I'm excited to see what the University of Tennessee can do this year because I believe that they have the type of quarterback and the type of offense that could allow them to be a 12-1, an 11-2 type football team and certainly warrant an invite into the college playoff. But I can't help but see my fandom is becoming much more passive for the sake of college football and for college sport because college football drives most other sports. I hope that this turmoil is temporary because having this type of turmoil over long periods of time, people are just going to lose interest. Rivalries need stability. You have to play one another consistently, and you have to have the type of conference structure now in order to do so, because making a deal for one college team to play another with all the money involved and outside of their own conference infrastructure, it's practically impossible today. So there's my ignorant, meandering college football playoff preview segment. Some teams will play, some will win, and some will lose. And the ones that win will inevitably be invited to this expanded college football playoff where, again, the teams will play, some will win and some will lose, and eventually one will be crowned national champion, and I will probably have to look up that team who wins the national championship to figure out what the hell conference that they're in. This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.